Hey, welcome. We're here at AnDevCon 2014, San Francisco, in the foyer of the Grand Regency Hyatt. And I'm here with Dave Smith with New Circle. He's our Android practice lead. In fact, we just had a really great panel discussion last night, didn't we, Dave?
We did.
We did. You guys should check that out. In the meantime, though, Dave, why don't you introduce yourself here to our audience and tell us what you're passionate about?
Sure. Well, I've been developing Android for about 5 years now. With various different consulting organizations and stuff like that. I'm an independent contractor for a couple of years in there as well. Prior to Android, I really wasn't much of a software developer. Actually, my background is in electrical engineering and embedded systems. So very recently, I've gained a lot of passion in running Android in the embedded environment. So I like a lot of things dealing with internals and the framework as a whole, as opposed to just the application layer. And anything having to do with hardware at all. So Bluetooth, USB integration, those things are the things on Android that really excite me.
Excellent. And what are you here doing at the conference?
So I gave 2 sessions. My first one was on Bluetooth Low Energy and some of the new features that came in Android Lollipop and how that's really kind of pushed the platform along in terms of Bluetooth support and compatibility. And then I gave an internals-based talk the next day on the Android startup mechanism and kind of walking through the process of all the different components that you can see as you go from your power button to the main launcher app.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So do you have many people actually building custom ROMs now and doing the Cyanogenmodding and reading their phone?
You know, it's exploding. Not so much in the custom ROM, because that's kind of been a thing for a really long time, but as the cost of single board hardware comes down and down and down, and companies like Intel and even Qualcomm are willing to give direct support for these boards with Android board support packages straight out of the box. Really any of us can go online, get a super powerful board for like 50 bucks. And go get Android. Don't even have to build it yourself. Just go get an Android image, put it on this device, and you're ready to go. So this stuff is everywhere now, and it's just going to continue that direction.
So speaking of that, actually, where do you see things trending then? Do you see these types of devices proliferating?
The embedded devices?
Yeah, the Internet of Things running Android.
Yeah, I do definitely. Now, I don't want to make that seem like Android is going to be the embedded OS, that will take over everything. I think it has a very specific use case, but it's a use case that people are going to want to see more and more.
What is that use case?
I think the biggest thing is Linux has been in the embedded environment for a very long time, and I think it will continue to be there, but as people get more used to touch interface with the devices that they have in their pocket, they want to see that same experience out in the world around them. So, as we start to make things and machines around us smarter and smarter, along with that comes that human-machine interface that people are going to expect to be able to touch, swipe, pinch, these types of interactions, and Android is just well suited for that because it's designed around that paradigm. So the ability to not only have a embedded Linux-based system, which a lot of people in the embedded world are already familiar with, but add on top of that this amazing software stack that now gives you all the UI toolkit and connectivity features that anybody can write a simple application and get a real great user experience in their toaster, for example.
That'd be really cool. So you're talking about running Android apps on a toaster or a microwave. Do you think that'll actually happen?
I do. Maybe not in the next 5 years, but it's already in refrigerators and washing machines and other appliances like that. So as miniaturization comes along, it'll be all over your house eventually.
Oh, very cool. It's something to watch for. So now, this year, there's already been a bunch of announcements in Android. You had a bunch of announcements about new technologies and Android Lollipop coming out. Now here at Google at AnDevCon, we're actually hearing how all these technologies are playing and rolling out. What do you think is the most exciting trend to come out this year in Android?
I think a couple things come to mind. The one thing that everybody really kind of looks at, because it's the most user-facing, is this whole thing about material design. And I do think that's interesting, and I think it's a great move forward for the platform. It's good to see the design evolving, and it's much simpler than it was before. For me personally, though, a couple things that I find interesting are, first of all, Google has done an amazing job this time around with the app compat and the support library. This is probably one of the first releases cases where as soon as they introduced a bunch of new features in terms of the design language, at the same time, they gave you the compatibility library that would take those features as much as possible all the way back to early versions. Certainly long before most of the versions any of us are even supporting anymore. So it wasn't where we had this new great stuff and then said, okay, cool, in 5 years we'll be ready to do that. And I said, no, today you can do this in your applications. They've done an amazing job on that team bringing app compat up to speed. The other really interesting one for me that's really more hidden from most people, even developers, is that Android has this new runtime, what we're calling Art. And that has become the default now in Android Lollipop, and that runtime is just an amazing piece of engineering.
So this totally replaces Dalvik?
It totally replaces Dalvik.
Will Dalvik even be an option anymore on Android Lollipop?
Technically speaking, I guess manufacturers could provide that option, but I don't believe they will. You know, Art is so far advanced from where we were in Dalvik that it has so many innovative features and just creative ways of dealing with trying to keep the cross-platform compatibility of what developers expect from a Java-based environment, but then drilling that down into true native-like performance on the device. You know, this idea that you can take your high-level bytecode, compile it on device so that what you're actually running is very specific to the architecture, and the whole process that they do that with is just, it's something I've never seen before in a mobile device. And I think
Tell us a little bit more. How does that work, and how's that going to change the development experience?
Well, I think the good news is I don't think it's going to change the development experience much for most. You know, luckily that burden falls almost exclusively on Google and them developing the tool chains, because most developers are developing their applications using Java, and the beauty of the way that Art is designed is that Art is designed to take the output of that build, the DEX bytecode, and convert that on device during the installation time into whatever the native binary code is necessary for, whether it's ARM or x86 or whatever that specific device is. So the developer tools in that case don't have to change. The only developers that are really affected by this are developers using native code. And the good news is the NDK has been able to support, you know, all of these new features for a very long time. And so with the exception of maybe some minor tweaks to some of the hackery that some native developers have had to do to work around some bugs that were in Dalvik, even most native developers are going to be just fine with the code that they have. If nothing else, they may just have to recompile with the latest versions of the NDK.
Now, speaking to developers, Android Studio is now out. It's beta, but it's getting much more mature. When do you think it's going to be the right time for teams to start thinking about cutting over to Android Studio? Has that time come yet?
Now.
Of
course, me personally, I would have said now a year ago, but that's just who I am. We've been using Android Studio internally, you know, on all the projects I've worked on since the day it was released. You know, previous to that, that's partially because I was a very big fan of IntelliJ. I think they have great environments, and JetBrains in general just does a great job with their products. So I was very excited to just jump on board with that. But I do understand that in the early preview days, it was a little bit difficult, and there was definitely a big learning curve introducing Gradle and all this stuff at the same time. Really, when the beta was released at I/O earlier this year, that was the point where I really didn't have any reservations anymore about telling someone you ought to be on this system. You know, the system is stable enough. Changes may come, but it's stable enough that you should be migrating your projects onto this without too much headache. And if you don't start now, you're only going to get left behind. You know, after hearing a number of Google engineers speak on the topic, they've made it very clear that the Eclipse and the ADT environment is a wasteland at this point. You know, they will probably continue to do some basic maintenance and bug fixes, but they're not going to do any new features or anything like that. That project that ship has sailed. So if you're not on Android Studio now, you ought to be. And if for no other reason, the only remaining complaint that I've heard from people is, well, I'll wait for 1.0. Well, 1.0 RC1 was released yesterday. So there goes that. You got to get on this thing or you're going to get left behind.
Now, for companies that have an existing code base and they're running right now on ADT Eclipse, and they say, okay, I want to make this cut, what's involved for them? How much effort are we talking about? What are the gotchas they got to watch for, and what are some of the best ways to make the transition?
Sure. In my experience, the developer tools themselves have done a really good job of easing that transition as best they can. Android Studio has a phenomenal project importer that really is not an import project as much as it is a migration tool. In the early versions, it really was an import where they would keep an Eclipse or ADT-based project in the same structure that it was, and they would try and manipulate the Gradle files to work with that existing project, kind of trying to keep it compatible, so if you wanted to go back to the old tools, you can. Now, if you import a project, it is a full migration. They take what was your project, and they recreate a new one in the proper Gradle structure, transforming anything they can, taking jar files out, replacing them with dependencies. I mean, they really convert what you've been doing into something new underneath the new paradigm with Gradle. So that's the best tool that I've seen. And the only cases where that tends to get a little bit hairy is in some of the NDK stuff. Now, with 1.0, they've made some advancements here, and I haven't had a lot of time to test them, but generally speaking, there were some edge cases with NDK building that the Gradle didn't fully support or didn't support very well. And so sometimes they would, developers would have to manipulate how their project was set up to use the NDK code in a pre-built way instead of allowing Gradle to build the native sources alongside the Java. Now, a lot of that stuff has been fixed and will continue to get fixed, but that may be the only headache that some people still run into in trying to move from one to the other.
So if you're not running native code, it should be a pretty easy switch over.
It should be dead simple at that.
Except you got to learn a little bit about Gradle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fair enough. Now, looking at the companies that you work with on a regular basis, what's the #1 mistake that you see time and time again that companies and teams are making when it comes to Android?
Well, I guess I'd have to say that the primary one, or the one that comes up time and time again over all the years, even now, is a misuse of context. Context in Android is something that we all kind of fear, but is a necessary evil. It's sort of a God object. It's something that you need everywhere. Just about everything that you use either inherits from or has access to a context. And not everybody fully understands the reasons why it exists or anything like that. Activities are context, services are context, application is. And anything that isn't a context, like a receiver, is given one. So you always need it. You end up passing it around like a peace pipe. I mean, it's this crazy thing that someone who's new to Android doesn't fully understand. And the biggest problem with it is they assume that all contexts are created equal, which is absolutely not true. An activity context and application context are not the same thing. They're essentially they implement the same interface, but underneath they're not the same object and they don't have the same capabilities. I wrote a blog post on this about a year or so ago that's almost gone viral for the same reason. Because people just don't understand it and they're screaming for good information.
So if somebody wants to find that blog post, what do they Google for?
Context Dave Smith, or even Context Android at this point. But the problem with it is, one, picking the wrong context to use for whatever your use case is. But the other is not realizing that because you pass context around so much, you may be holding references to this object for a longer period of time than you wanted to. And since many objects that are context are very heavy weight, like activities and services, that is a huge, probably the #1 cause of memory leaks in Android applications. So watching those references and making sure you have the right one for the right job, very important.
And what about for people looking to actually manage the relationship between their business logic and their activities, especially when they're dealing with the fact that activities are getting recycled or they're just being recreated when there's a small device configuration or orientation change. And people are struggling with, well, how do I manage my context, my callbacks, my state across this life cycle? Do you have any advice for these people?
There's a lot of debate in the community about what the right way is to solve that problem. I'm not sure that I subscribe to any one theory. It kind of seems like with each application project I work on, one option or one framework versus another might work better in this case. But I think that the overarching principle when you're dealing with that is that separation is key. And I think that the biggest thing to make sure that you're doing in your application is that your business logic is properly separated from, or at least loosely coupled to, your activities themselves. The best way to think of an application design with activities is that they could be taken out from underneath you at any time. And so the activity should really do little more than dealing directly with the views it's trying to present. Anything beyond that has any sort of duration, whether it's accessing stuff on disk or trying to hit the network or even just doing some long-running computation. Anything that you start directly inside of an activity is going to affect the system's ability to manage its life cycle. Now, whether that means you move it into a service or some type of a singleton, or there are these reactive frameworks to try and mitigate some of those things as well. That I think is still up in the air and maybe even a little bit application specific. But the biggest thing to keep in mind is your activity should be very, very simple and doing little more than receiving information to put up on the view. This is where things like the loader pattern became so helpful, but there are other issues with just assuming you can shove everything into a loader. But generally speaking, it's the simplest way for most people to get started by getting that feedback or that callback input into their activity in a way that allows the framework to manage that disconnect a little bit better. So it's a good starting point.
Fair enough. And do you have any last parting thoughts here for our audience before we wrap up and head back into the conference?
I guess the only thing that I could think of to say would just be if you are waiting to jump on the bandwagon to start using Lollipop or start developing for Lollipop specific stuff, don't wait. Get in there now. The app compat stuff and just the advances that we see with art and all, this is one of the biggest releases we've seen in a long time, and there's some really exciting stuff in there that you don't have to wait until 80% of Android users are on this platform to get there. And even those that are, there's some amazing new stuff that they can take advantage of that you can start building into your app. So if you're afraid and you want to wait till things get a little bit bigger, just take the plunge.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us, Dave.
Thank you.
Have a great day.